My name is Aileen Hogan. I'm a GMP inspector with the HPRA. I've been in this role since joining the organisation in 2019, so around 3 years ago now. And today I'm going to take you through an overview of the HPRA's GMP inspection programme. Specifically, we're going to take a look at the summary data from the programme spanning the last 4 years. So that is the period of January 2018 to December 2021 inclusive. This review is twofold. Firstly, it's to share with you, I suppose, what the programme itself has looked like. We felt this may be of something of interest to industry. And secondly, we wanted to share with you, I suppose, the outcome of the inspections with the aim of identifying areas for future focus and improvement. And that's something that we felt we could do, for industry and for ourselves as GMP inspectors. The presentation itself is split into two parts. The first is a high-level review of the inspections that have been performed, the nature and outcome of those. And the second part is really taking a closer look at the more significant deficiencies which have been cited. And within this presentation, when I refer to significant, I really mean those which have been classified as major or critical. The scope is not limited, so there is a list of different types of inspections which have been included in the review, but essentially this review does include all GMP inspections which have been performed in the period. And finally, in terms of recommendations, and I guess in support of my previous statement that we would like, this review to aid the, identification of areas for future focus and improvement, we would recommend to, companies and to sites to really look at this presentation, consider the deficiencies that are referenced here, along with the, areas in which deficiencies are mentioned as being commonly cited, and to review that and consider that in light of the other presentations which have also been shared as part of this open day, to assist in inspection preparation and also when conducting internal audits. So I'll go into the first part of the presentation, which is our high-level review of the programme. And this first slide is looking at the number of GMP inspections which were performed during the period. So for 2018, 2019 and 2021, there is what we would consider to be so in 2020, you will see a reduction in the number of GMP inspections, and that is attributed to a period at the start of the pandemic where a reduced number of inspections were performed, whilst the HPRA really worked with EU partners to develop, define and also implement the process for distance assessment. So that's it that you see on the graph for 2020 as a direct consequence of that time. On this next slide, then, we're looking at the nature of those inspections. So the first graph on the left-hand side, you'll see there's no trend of note really with regard to the ratio of routine to non-routine across the period. Annually, approximately 60% of the inspections that the HPRA performs are on a routine basis. When we look at the breakdown of national versus foreign inspections, which is on the right-hand side graph, we note more of a difference across the period. So it does appear that in 2021, the number of foreign inspections performed has increased in comparison to previous years. So you'll see we're looking at that lower line on the graph, the blue line, that it's approximately 25% of the inspections performed were foreign inspections in 2021, and that's in comparison to 5 to 15% in previous years. We don't have, a definitive reason or root cause for this, but Brexit we're considering may be a contributing factor, with GMP inspections previously performed by the MHRA being performed by other EMA agencies. So then this is our final overview slide, and on this slide we're going to look at the outcome of GMP inspections in terms of the number of deficiencies. And the classification of those deficiencies that were cited. So the first graph here is looking at the number of critical, major and other deficiencies as a percentage of the total number of deficiencies cited that year. So there is consistency with regard to the distribution of those deficiencies across the three classifications. For example, we consistently see critical deficiencies account for less than 0.5% of the total deficiencies cited annually. Majors account for anywhere between 10 and 14% of deficiencies cited annually, and deficiencies of other classification are, as you would expect, the most common, and they're accounting consistently for anywhere between 86 and 90% of the total deficiencies cited annually. The second graph here then is showing the deficiencies cited, I guess, in terms of the chapter of the EU GMP guide against which they were cited. So again, when we look at this graph, there is consistency with regards to the percentage distribution of deficiencies against the chapters of the EU GMP guide. It is also worth mentioning that this consistency is in spite of the introduction of the distance assessment process in 2020, during which, it would be reasonable to expect to see challenges in assessing maybe some areas or elements, for example premises and equipment, or more ease in assessing other areas or elements, for example review of electronic documentation on a remote platform. That's not something that we've seen come through in this review. So this is the last look that we're going to take at deficiencies in their totality or in their entirety, because in the next sections we're going to focus on critical and major deficiencies. So just to point out, whilst we're taking this look at the deficiencies in their totality, that the majority of deficiencies are being cited against Chapter 1 pharmaceutical quality system, and that's closely followed, I guess, by Chapter 5 production and Chapter 3 premises and equipment. So in this next part of the presentation, then we're going to take a closer look at the more significant deficiencies cited during the period. So the major and critical deficiencies. The other deficiencies are not within scope of the following sections. So starting out with the criticals, included the definition of the critical deficiency for reference, and as a reminder for everyone, for a deficiency to be critical, there needs to be evidence that the deficiency has produced or leads to a significant risk of producing a product which is harmful to the human or veterinary patient, or a product which could result in a harmful residue in a food-producing animal. So these deficiencies signify situations where a deficiency identified is considered to represent significant risk to patients. So if you remember back to earlier slides, 3 critical deficiencies have been cited during the period. The areas in which those 3 critical deficiencies have been cited are listed here on the left-hand side. The first cited was under the categorization of pharmaceutical quality system, which is Chapter 1 of the guide. The second was cited under controls for aseptic operations, which falls under production, Chapter 5 of the guide. And the third critical that was cited was cited under quality control, Chapter 6 of the guide. So it's worth noting here there's 3 different categorizations, categories in which the criticals have been cited, and we would also like to point out at this point that the 3 criticals were cited at 3 different sites, and they're not specific to one particular type of site, in terms of the activities performed at the site or otherwise. So in order to look at these 3 criticals further, and I guess in light of the fact that there's only 3 of them, it's a small number, what we've been able to do, I suppose, is really to strip back the deficiencies to the bare bones. We've removed examples or wording specific to the site or inspection performed, so we don't identify anyone or breach confidentiality. But we're going to read down through the 3 deficiencies in their kind of bare state, and what we hope, I suppose, is that it will clearly demonstrate, I suppose, why these findings were considered to fulfill the definition of critical deficiency. First, critical deficiency which was cited under pharmaceutical quality system, and the deficiency cited was as listed here. So the pharmaceutical quality system was not correctly implemented or effective, such that GMP controls for the manufacture of aseptically prepared medicinal products were deficient and posed a significant risk of producing a product which could be harmful to the patient. So there's various subpoints here that form part of the deficiency, and within each of these there would have been various kind of subpoints or examples again, but as I said, we've kind of removed those and stripped this deficiency back to the kind of key points. So the program for environmental monitoring was deficient. Certain behaviours indicated a lack of understanding of basic microbiology principles and good aseptic practices. The approach taken to train and qualify production staff was deficient. Management of GMP records was deficient. The management of identified data integrity breaches at the site was deficient. Insufficient qualified personnel were available to carry out all the required tasks at the facility. Material management was inadequate, including management of cleaning supplies, autoclave gowning components, material sanitization and transfer processes. The second critical then that was cited related to controls for aseptic operations, and that was that there was a lack of sterility assurance in relation to aseptically processed products, in that aseptic processing and controls observed during the setup and filling were deficient. Deficiencies related to the autoclaving and filling equipment were observed. The environmental monitoring and personnel monitoring program implemented by the site was deficient. Management of media fills was deficient. The aseptic practices and behaviours observed during sterility testing were deficient. And then the final critical was related to lab activities and controls, and that was that appropriate measures had not been taken by the company following identification of issues related to QC data used to support QP certification and release of products to the market. This is evidenced by the following. Batches had been released to the market without having the required microbiological testing performed. The management of investigation related to a data integrity investigation in the QC laboratory following the recording of spurious test results where testing had not been conducted was inadequate. The company had not taken appropriate action when issues were identified during self-inspection of documentation. And finally, handling of deviation which related to the QP certification of batches prior to the required microbiological testing being completed was deficient. So in all three criticals, you can see that there are significant failures across multiple systems that ultimately result in a risk of producing product which could be harmful to patients, and that is the basis in all three of these cases for a critical deficiency being cited. So I hope that that's kind of clear from reading down. So taking a look at the majors next, and these are more abundant. So we've taken a slightly different approach to looking at these. Again, I've included the definition of a major here for ease of reference. It's different in form to that of a critical in that there are a few definitions for what may constitute a major deficiency. I do want to draw your attention to that because, in fact, the majority of majors cited within the period fall into the last part of this definition, in that they are a combination of several other deficiencies, none of which on their own may be major, but which may together represent a major deficiency. So why that's important, in subsequent slides, rather than list the majors in their entirety because of the huge number of majors, we have listed the most commonly occurring elements of major deficiencies. So it's something to keep in mind as we go through the subsequent slides. It will be evident, or it may be evident or obvious, that a lot of the deficiencies don't necessarily represent in themselves a deficiency which fulfills earlier parts of this definition. So in themselves, the deficiencies that you see may not be major, but they are commonly occurring elements which in combination with other deficiencies were considered to represent major deficiencies. So I just wanted to add that kind of clarity so that it's, people are not wondering as we go through, the deficiencies that are listed on subsequent slides. So similar to what we looked at for the criticals, there's a list here on the left-hand side, and it categorizes the major deficiencies cited during the period according to the area against which they were cited. So you'll see, for example, from this list that the most commonly major deficiencies relate to deviation, complaint, investigation, and there have been 53 major deficiencies cited in relation to this area during the period. Second to deviation, complaint, investigation is contamination control and cleaning validation, for which there have been 32 major deficiencies cited in the period. Third is manufacturing process and controls, which has had majors cited 23 times in the period, and so on. So you can go down through that list and kind of see the most commonly occurring areas. The other thing which I would like to point out, I suppose, while we're taking a look at this list, is that most of the topics which are being discussed by GMP inspectors at this open day feature on this list. So for example, QP oversight and outsourced activities, cleaning validation and out of specification lab investigations. These topics have been chosen for discussion or review at the GMP information day based on the fact that there have been reoccurring major deficiencies cited in these areas over the period I suppose we have seen an increase in the overall number of deficiencies cited in these areas throughout the period. So just to give that bit of context, that is the basis for most the GMP information day. So this is the format of the next few slides, quite a number of slides actually, as we go through this list on the left-hand side, and we're going to provide kind of examples of the commonly occurring elements of deficiencies which have formed, I guess. I guess what we're doing is we're providing examples of deficiencies which have formed either by themselves or in conjunction with other deficiencies, major deficiencies in each of these areas. So these slides are busy. I do apologise for that. But we did the slides, I suppose, like this in the knowledge that these slides would be available to people to review in their own time. And we just wanted to include, I suppose, as much information as we could in order for this to be kind of a worthwhile reference. I'm not going to read down through everything on the slides. I think people are more than capable of doing that themselves, and I think it would be more valuable to do it that way. So what I'm going to do is just kind of take you through the slides and maybe point out some key considerations as we're going down through the lists and the examples. So first of all, looking at deviation and complaint investigation, which is the first on the list, and as we mentioned, this is the most commonly occurring type of major, as we've already mentioned. So you can see from the numbers at the top of the blue box here, beside the title, deviation and complaint investigation, majors have been cited fairly consistently in this area across the 4-year period. By far, the nature of the deficiencies in this area are the most repetitive. So they consistently involve inadequate root cause analysis, inadequate level of detail in records, level of investigation not commensurate with the risk, inadequate trending and handling of reoccurrences, lack of effectiveness checks, and human error being commonly assigned without adequate justification or consideration for other potential root causes. And they are listed on this slide along with other examples. And also with examples of quality risk management, which is available on the lower portion of the slide. So the next two topics are management of suppliers and outsourced activities, and also batch certification and QP oversight. Richard's presentation from the information day is focused on some of the key elements for which we see deficiencies cited in these areas and aims to provide clarification in that regard. There are further examples listed on the slide. One of the examples listed here is an absence of or inadequate excipient risk assessment. And I just wanted to take, I suppose, this opportunity to mention the guidelines of 19th of March 2015 require a formalised risk assessment for ascertaining the appropriate GMP for excipients of medicinal products for human use. It is still something, I suppose, that 7 years on, we do on occasion see has not been implemented or adequately implemented at sites. In cases where we see that it hasn't been appropriately implemented or fully implemented, in line with the requirement, it's generally Chapter 4 of those guidelines which require the ongoing risk review to confirm application of appropriate GMP, which is the issue. So we just wanted to point that out. Another point to note here, just in relation to batch certification, is that the majority of major deficiencies cited in relation to batch certification activities have been cited at sites which exclusively perform batch certification activities. And that may put into context some of the examples listed here in the latter part in relation to the QP not being able to demonstrate their access to marketing authorizations, recent variations, and approved artwork. So just to give that bit of context. In relation to CAPA implementation, then the majority of majors cited here are related to implementation of CAPAs from previous HPRA inspections. So implementation of CAPAs from previous inspections, often something that forms part of our inspection plan, particularly where there have been major or critical deficiencies cited and we have seen significant risk. We do look at the target timelines during review of company responses and make sure that those target timelines are acceptable in terms of managing the risk of the deficiencies. So when we review this during inspection, we're really looking to see that CAPAs to address the deficiencies have been implemented, and they have been implemented in line with the target timelines outlined in post-inspection correspondence and responses. Where that hasn't been the case and where the company has not informed HPRA of delays or revised timelines, there have been major deficiencies cited. So we would just urge companies, I suppose, if there are significant changes to your implementation timelines or what you're intending to implement, to let us know. And moving on to production, this slide is looking at examples of deficiencies cited in relation to contamination control and cleaning validation. It was previously mentioned that this is the second highest area in which major deficiencies were cited during the period, and this topic is subject to further discussion and review as part of Themis's presentation, which is also part of the HPRA Open GMP Information Day. So just to point out, I suppose, the major deficiencies which have been cited in this area have been cited at sites which manufacture API, sterile and non-sterile drug product. PEMIS's presentation, as I said, which is part of the GMP Information Day, actually touches on, I think, all of these examples. So I'm not going to spend time focusing on any of these here right now. Manufacturing process and controls, although it is a reoccurring topic, the deficiencies can vary significantly due to the wide range of technologies and processes that we inspect. There are some general examples and more specific examples of the type of deficiencies we see listed here. The first ones that are listed here are quite general and cover the majority of deficiencies that have been cited for, and they are, lack of control of manufacturing recipes, manufacturing processes not in line with the registered process, and manufacturing processes not validated. Process validation, then, you will note a lot of the deficiencies cited here are in relation to documentation of validation activities, really. Firstly, in terms of planning. For example, the company is not capturing the rationale or justifying the approach to be taken during validation. And then secondly, in terms of reporting validation results, for example, companies not performing critical analysis of data or not reviewing all relevant data. I would point out, later on these slides is equipment qualification. The nature of the deficiencies for process validation actually tend to be quite similar to those cited for equipment qualification, in that they quite often centre around documentation, justification of approach, and critical analysis of results. So something just to consider. Material management, then, there have been a lower number of majors related to this area in recent years, so 2 deficiencies annually in the 2 years previous, compared to 6 in 2018 and 5 in 2019. The majority of these deficiencies relate to goods receipt checks and inventory management. In relation to goods receipts check, we would just point out that the expectation is that there are checks upon receipt to ensure that the goods being received are coming from an approved supplier and an approved manufacturer. So we expect to see a check of both supplier and manufacturer name and address at goods receipt. So then this next slide is looking at deficiencies related to controls for aseptic operations and environmental monitoring. During the period under review, these majors have been cited exclusively at sites which manufacture sterile drug product. So many of the majors here relate to personnel behaviours, upon which there is a lot of focus in grade A, B manufacturing environments. You'll see listed here, things like movement of personnel not controlled and methodical, gloves not regularly sanitized, manually sanitization of materials not being performed in a consistent unidirectional manner, and so on. So we would just point out, I suppose, that there is significant focus on personnel training and behaviours, and the controls around those in clean environments like this. In relation to environmental monitoring, then, I suppose one thing that we would just point out is where there is a change in approach with regards to the media in use for an environmental monitoring program. For example, a move from TSA and SDA to TSA only. It is expected that the site has justification to support this, and that justification would include an assessment of data relevant and specific to the site in question. So then in relation to lab activities and controls, similar to manufacturing processes and controls, which we looked at in an earlier slide, the deficiencies cited under this category can vary significantly due to the wide range of testing and technologies that we inspect. Again, there are a few common deficiencies cited here. One which reoccurs quite regularly is inadequate control of logbooks, analytical data sheets, or equivalent. And we would just mention, there should be controls around issuance, review, and reconciliation of these document types, similar to what you would have for your production documentation, batch records, etc. Out of specification lab investigations is a topic which is covered by Peter as part of his presentation for the GMP Information Day. And just to say, I suppose, similar to deviation and complaint investigation, these type of deficiencies, they are repetitive in nature also, and you can see some of the examples listed here. Many relate to inadequate controls around when and how resampling and retesting are authorised and performed, and the level of investigation that would be required in advance of performing those tasks. So these, similar to the other investigations, they are quite repetitive in nature. Computerized systems then is one of the lesser cited categories on this list. Deficiencies cited here most commonly relate to inadequate review of electronic data and or audit trails, inadequate control of user permissions and or access rights, and inadequate assessment of the recoverability and integrity of laboratory data restored from a backup server or otherwise. Amazon equipment then, again, wide-ranging in terms of the scope of the deficiencies cited in this area. So the deficiencies cited, at sites which manufacture sterile drug product tend to be focused around segregation between grade A and grade B zones. Deficiencies cited in sites which manufacture API, non-sterile drug product, low bioburden drug substance, or sites of physical importation tend to be more around facility and equipment maintenance and sanitization. And you can see examples of both of those types of deficiencies in this list. Equipment qualification then, another category in which there's a lot of repetition in terms of the deficiencies cited. We mentioned, the deficiencies can be quite similar in nature to process validation, and in that they commonly relate to inadequate documentation. Generally, in either in the planning stage or the reporting and concluding stage. So examples here, and you will see familiarities with process validation or, not documenting the rationale or justification for leveraging of data from earlier stages of qualification, not document or justifying predefined acceptance criteria, an absence of critical evaluation of results, and failures encountered during qualification. Another point that we would just mention here, and something that does come up regularly, is the positions of chemical indicators, biological indicators, and temperature probes. Where employed during qualifications, they should be justified and they should be documented. And finally, then, this slide contains examples of major deficiencies which have been cited related to documentation. So these examples are fairly self-explanatory, generally speaking. They relate to documents not being adequately controlled, procedures not being current, not being reflective of operations at the site, not containing critical detail or being easy to follow, records being completed retrospectively. This slide also includes so any category in which majors were cited less than 4 times during the period are included in this list and have not featured in previous sections. One of the questions that came through with the registration for the information day was regarding trends and deficiencies related to serialization. So I would just take this opportunity to say that during the period, there were no major or critical deficiencies cited in relation to serialization. And that is the end of the review. So I know there is a lot of information in the slides, and people, hopefully will refer back to those and in their own time. But as we're kind of limited in time with this presentation, I'll proceed to summarize. So I guess across the 4-year period examined, the number of GMP inspections has been consistent, other than the periods that we saw at the start of the pandemic, during which time the H4A, together with EU partners, worked to implement the distant assessment process. The introduction of the distant assessment process in Q3 2020, it doesn't appear to have resulted in significant difference in the overall number or nature of significant deficiencies, so the trends are fairly consistent. Across the period, we see on average around 60% of the inspections performed on a routine basis. Approximately, 80% to 85% of inspections performed for sites in Ireland. Critical deficiencies account for less than 1% of the total deficiencies cited, majors for approximately 12%, and other deficiencies make up the remainder at approximately 87%. The majority of the major deficiencies cited are a combination of several other deficiencies, none of which on their own may be major, but which may together represent a major deficiency and should be explained and reported as such. Critical deficiencies cited, and there were 3 of them, and they've been cited where there has been a significant risk of producing a product which is harmful to the human or veterinary patient. Pharmaceutical quality system, Chapter 1, has the largest number of deficiencies across the period, and leads the way for major deficiencies, with over a third of majors being cited against this chapter. Chapter 5, production, is a close second, and it's worth noting, that the pharmaceutical quality system and production are the two highest, most commonly cited, I suppose, in terms of the overall number of deficiencies, but critical deficiencies also kind of mirror this, because of the three critical deficiencies, one has been cited against pharmaceutical quality system and one against production, in addition to a third being cited against Chapter 6 quality control. So in terms of conclusion, when we consider, those chapters that are most commonly cited, we see that investigations and root cause analysis does appear quite frequently. This is similar to findings previously cited by other regulatory agencies. They're findings that are published online, and they're easy to find. And it is considered, that this highlights the importance of quality systems and the quality unit, investigations and assignment of root cause, and the continued focus on these areas. These remain a significant focus for us during inspection. And, this is really looping back, I suppose, to the recommendations on the first slide. We would urge and recommend that companies evaluate the deficiencies that are referenced in this presentation, along with considering, information in the other presentations that have formed part of the GMP Information Day, as, they also, I guess, relate to common deficiencies and common issues that we see, and use this information, I suppose, that is gained through these reviews and evaluations to assist in inspection preparation and internal audits. So that is the conclusion of the presentation. I hope that the review has been of some relevance and of interest to people. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out, and thank you very much for your attention.